Hey, William, Jimmy, I just don't think you have any ground to stand on at all to suggest that 2nd Maccabees teaches purgatory or even a conscious intermediate state of any sort. Frankly, I have no idea how the connection between the protasis and the apodosis in 2nd Maccabees chapter 12 is always missed. I mean, it's very clear what the implication is. Very clear. There is no conscious afterlife according to 2nd Maccabees, and that's my appeal. Hello everybody, welcome back to Study is Key. That is, welcome back if you've been here before. If you've not been here before, welcome to the channel. Hopefully you'll stick around to the end of the video and then subscribe to the channel so you can stick around for future videos as well. Now, as you can see on the screen, today I'm going to be addressing 2nd Maccabees, and as the title has already revealed, I believe that 2nd Maccabees teaches that there is no conscious afterlife. And the reason I've tagged William Albrecht and Jimmy Akin in the title is because I've seen both of them appeal to 2nd Maccabees in defense of purgatory, and they are large names in the Roman Catholic online YouTube sphere, if you want to call it that. So I guess without further ado, let's just get into the presentation here and leave a comment at the end of the video if you have any objections, questions, or whatever. You know, I don't need to tell you all of this. You know how YouTube works. So without further ado, let's get into the presentation. I just want to begin by reading 2nd Maccabees chapter 12, verses 38 to 44, and then we'll move forward. It says, "Then Judas assembled his army and went to the city of Adullam. On the next day, as had now become necessary, Judas and his men went up to take the bodies of the fallen and to bring them back to lie with their kindred. Then, under the tunic of each one of the dead, they found sacred tokens of the idols of Jamnia, which the law forbids the Jews to wear. And it became clear to all that this was the reason these men had fallen. So they turned to supplication, praying that the sin that had been committed might be wholly blotted out. The noble Judas took up a collection, man by man, to the amount of 2,000 drachmas of silver, and sent it to Jerusalem to provide for a sin offering. In doing this, he acted very well and honorably, taking account of the resurrection. For if he were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise again, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead." Now, let's see what William Albrecht has to say about this passage. In a video entitled "Is Purgatory Biblical?" responding to Michael Brown on his Patristic Pillars YouTube channel at the 55-minute and 24-second mark, William Albrecht says, quote, "They're praying so the fallen can be loosed from the suffering they're undergoing in the afterlife," end quote. But is that right? Does that strike you as what the passage is saying? Let's just read the end part again, starting with "in doing," third line from the bottom. "In doing this, he acted very well and honorably, taking account of the resurrection. For if he were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise again, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead." Now, zeroing in on that yellow portion there, I want to point out something. This is the form you have in the yellow portion. You have the protasis, which is a fancy word for essentially an if statement. The protasis is for if he were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise again. And then you have the apodosis, which is a fancy term for a then statement. You don't actually have to have the word then there. It just has to, mean that. So the apodosis is, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead. So again, the protasis, for if he were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise again. The apodosis, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead. Now here's my argument. It's very simple. The apodosis, most reasonably, assumes that if there is no resurrection, the dead are no more. In other words, it most reasonably assumes that the soul does not remain conscious after death, and that consciousness is only regained in resurrection. Now, on the left here, you still have the protasis and the apodosis and the argument so that you can consult them whenever you need to, but I'm going to be mounting a defense of my argument here on the right. So again, at any point, if you just need to consult or, reread the argument, it's right there on screen for you. So let's begin. Which makes more sense? If he were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead, A, whose souls were being punished for their sins in a conscious afterlife, or B, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead whose souls did not remain conscious after death. I think that on the surface, without me even having to explain why, B makes a lot more sense. If he were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead whose souls did not remain conscious after death. But let's prod a little bit. Let's prod scenario A. If he were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead whose souls were being punished for their sins in a conscious afterlife. Question: is praying for their sins to be blotted out superfluous and foolish if there is a conscious afterlife where souls suffer punishment but there's no resurrection? The answer is no, because even if he didn't expect them to rise under scenario A, there's still punishment to be reduced in intensity or duration. In other words, even if you don't rise again from the dead, if there's a conscious afterlife where you're suffering punishment, then obviously it's not superfluous and foolish to pray that their sins would be blotted out so that their punishment would be reduced in intensity or duration. Now let's do the same and prod scenario B a little bit more. If he were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead whose souls did not remain conscious after death. Question: is praying for their sins to be blotted out superfluous and foolish if there is no conscious afterlife nor resurrection? The answer is obviously yes, because even if their sins aren't blotted out, they won't ever suffer punishment for those sins. Right? If the dead die and there is no conscious afterlife and they'll never be raised from the dead, then so what, even if you don't blot out their sins? I mean, what's the point? They're never going to suffer the consequences of their sins anyway, neither in a conscious afterlife or at the resurrection. So it would truly be superfluous and foolish to pray to blot their sins out if there is no afterlife and if there is no resurrection. So again, I want to ask the question, which makes more sense? We're going to look at scenario A again and scenario B, but with a little bit more meat on those bones. So again, which makes more sense? Scenario A: if he were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead whose souls were being punished for their sins in a conscious afterlife, when blotting out their sins could have reduced the intensity or duration of their punishment. Or scenario B: if he were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead whose souls did not remain conscious after death, because even if their sins aren't blotted out, they won't ever suffer punishment for those sins. Again, the answer is very clear. It is B. B makes a lot more sense. If he were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead whose souls did not remain conscious after death, because even if their sins aren't blotted out, they won't ever suffer the punishment that they deserve for those sins. But under scenario A, what's superfluous and foolish about praying that sins would be blotted out in the case of certain people when they are currently undergoing punishment in a conscious afterlife, allegedly? You see, this point about it being superfluous and foolish if there is no resurrection only makes sense if there's no conscious afterlife. Because if there is one, and they're currently suffering punishment, then there's nothing superfluous and foolish about it. And so therefore, it's most reasonable to conclude that 2 Maccabees denies the notion that the soul remains conscious after death, just like Sirach. See my previous video about that if you're interested. I would recommend you do. Now, let's go over to Jimmy Akin and see what he has to say about 2 Maccabees 15, verses 6 to 15. In an article entitled Quick Answers on Soul Sleep, Jimmy Akin writes, quote, "Do we have any evidence of human consciousness after death and before resurrection? Indeed, we do. There is the passage in 2 Maccabees where it is revealed that the prophet Jeremiah is dead, but nevertheless, quote, loves the brethren and prays much for the people and the holy city," end quote. And that is a reference to 2 Maccabees, that's supposed to say 15:14. Not 5:14. Anyways, this is the text in question. 2 Maccabees 15, verses 6 to 15 reads as follows, quote, "This Nicanor, in his utter boastfulness and arrogance, had determined to erect a public monument of victory over Judas and his forces. But Maccabeus did not cease to trust with all confidence that he would get help from the Lord. He exhorted his troops not to fear the attack of the Gentiles, but to keep in mind the former times when help had come to them from heaven, and so to look for the victory that the Almighty would give them, encouraging them from the law and the prophets, and reminding them also of the struggles they had won. He made them the more eager. and he cheered them all by relating a dream, a sort of vision, which was worthy of belief. What he saw was this: Onias had been high priest, then in the same fashion another appeared, and Onias spoke, saying, "This is a man who loves the family of Israel and prays much for the people in the holy city, Jeremiah the prophet of God." Jeremiah stretched out his right hand and gave to Judas a golden sword, and as he gave it, he addressed him thus: "Take this holy sword, a gift from God, with which you will strike down your adversaries." End quote. Now, the very obvious response to Jimmy Akin is that while 2 Maccabees 15:14 does say, hundreds of years after Jeremiah's death, that Jeremiah, quote, prays much for the people in the holy city, verse 11 reveals that this is said of him in a dream, a sort of vision. And plus, this response coheres with the obvious implication of, or the implication behind, again, a mistake on my slide, this response coheres with the obvious implication of the words of 2 Maccabees 12, verses 38 through 44. Now, that said, let's try to steelman Jimmy Akin's appeal. First of all, we might say that although Jeremiah prays for the people in Judas's dream, the text says that it was a dream, a sort of vision, which was worthy of belief. And secondly, we might say, well, in verse 8, we're told that Judas exhorted his troops to, quote, keep in mind the former times when help had come to them from heaven, suggesting that the dream of Jeremiah praying might have been a way of communicating that Jeremiah really does still pray for the people in real life as well, constituting help from heaven at the present time. Now again, we have the steel man on the left here for you to reference if need be, and we're going to have the refutation here on the right, and we're going to begin with the first point of the steel man. Jeremiah is also said to give Judas a golden sword in verse 15, saying to Judas, quote, take this holy sword, a gift from God, with which you will strike down your adversaries. Now, is it worthy of belief that Judas was going to strike down his adversaries with the very sword that Jeremiah entrusted to him in his dream? Of course not. When he woke up from that dream, the sword was gone. It wasn't there, right? It was a dream. So the fact that the dream was, quote, worthy of belief doesn't mean that any specific detail therein can be taken to match reality. What's being referred to as worthy of belief is what the details in the dream symbolize. The significance of Jeremiah praying for the people in Judas's dream is that it calls to mind the last time Jeremiah prayed for the people. God responded positively to his prayer by saying that if the people stayed in Judah, he would protect them from their adversaries. Jeremiah 42, verses 1 to 12. So Jeremiah praying in Judas's dream symbolized that God would grant Judas and his army victory over their adversaries too. And this fits well with 2 Maccabees 15:9, in which Judas is said to have encouraged his troops, quote, from the law and the prophets, with the dream serving as a nod to affirm the encouragement they had taken. Now, Jeremiah praying for the people at the time of Judas Maccabeus is no more real than the scene in Pharaoh's dream, in which 7 sickly cows came up out of the Nile and devoured 7 healthy cows. See Genesis 41, verses 1 to 4. Now, what was worthy of belief in Pharaoh's dream was what the scene symbolized, not that sickly cows were coming up out of the Nile and eating healthy cows in real life. Now, let's look at the second point in the steel man. In verse 8, we are told that Judas exhorted his troops to, quote, keep in mind the former times when help had come to them from heaven, end quote, suggesting that the dream of Jeremiah praying might have been a way of communicating that Jeremiah really does still pray for the people in real life as well, constituting help from heaven at the present time. Now, here's my refutation. Appealing to verse 8 fails for several reasons. The first of which is that the righteous dead, like Jeremiah, were not thought to be in heaven, but in Hades. And you can see 2 Maccabees chapter 6, verse 23 for confirmation of this. So the connection between Jeremiah praying for the people in Judas's dream and the notion of help from heaven is completely unjustified. Again, Jeremiah would not have been thought to have been in heaven, but in Hades. And so trying to connect this verse about help from heaven to Jeremiah praying makes no sense, because even if Jeremiah were still praying, it wouldn't be from heaven. And the second point is that based on 2 Maccabees 15, verses 22 to 23, and you can compare this with 2 Maccabees chapter 8, verses 19 through 20, it's clear that in speaking of help from heaven, what's in mind is God lending a hand in battle, not a human praying in heaven. And this also fits better with Judas mentioning former times of help from heaven. So in light of all these considerations, the steel man fails to stand up to scrutiny. So 2 Maccabees chapter 15, verses 6 through 15 offers no credible support whatsoever for the notion of a conscious afterlife between death and resurrection. And therefore, it is still most reasonable to conclude that 2 Maccabees denies the notion that the soul remains conscious after death, just like Sirach. Again, see my previous video if you're interested, and you should be. So that's it for today. William, Jimmy, if either of you have listened to this video all the way through, I'll be interested in hearing your thoughts either in the comments or in some sort of response video or whatever. I just don't think you have any ground to stand on at all to suggest that 2 Maccabees teaches purgatory or even a conscious intermediate state of any sort. Relying on what is said of a prophet in a dream is very weak ground. I mean, if that has to be something you appeal to support a conscious intermediate state in the book of 2 Maccabees, I think that just reveals how weak the case really is. And frankly, I have no idea how the connection between the protasis and the apodosis in 2 Maccabees chapter 12 is always missed. I mean, it's very clear what the implication is. Very clear. There is no conscious afterlife according to 2 Maccabees, and that's my appeal. So, if anybody has any questions or comments, of course, feel free to leave those down below in the comment section, and I'll do my best to get back to all of you. So that's it. I'll see you guys in the next video, and remember that study is key.